The moment everything went wrong? At first, it looked beautiful. A sunset unlike anything people had ever seen. Deep crimson light stretched across the horizon, painting entire cities in a glowing red haze. People stopped what they were doing. Phones came out. Windows opened. Strangers pointed upward in silence. It was mesmerizing. But beauty can be dangerous when it hides something no one understands. Because within minutes, the color didn't fade. It deepened. The sky wasn't setting. It was changing. And no one knew it yet, but this was the beginning of one of the most unexplained atmospheric events in recorded human history. A normal day that never should have become history. The day began like any other across the world. In coastal cities, fishermen prepared their nets under clear skies. In inland towns, farmers checked irrigation lines. In dense urban centers, millions moved through routines so familiar they barely noticed them. Nothing felt wrong. Nothing felt unusual. But high above the surface, beyond human sight, the atmosphere was already shifting. It started with something almost invisible, a subtle distortion in upper atmospheric particles, then a slight irregularity in solar light scattering, then a change in ion density that no one immediately flagged as dangerous. On paper, it looked like noise. In reality, it was the first symptom of something no forecasting model had ever predicted. The first signs science ignored. At 8:14 UTC, a satellite monitoring station in orbit registered a minor anomaly. Light scattering patterns over the northern hemisphere began to deviate from expected behavior. At first, engineers assumed sensor calibration drift. At 9:02 UTC, a second satellite confirmed the same pattern. Still, no alarm was raised. Atmospheric systems are noisy by nature. Earth is a chaotic planet. But then came the third confirmation, and the fourth, and the fifth. By midday, something undeniable was forming. A vast, coordinated atmospheric disturbance spanning multiple continents. But it wasn't behaving like a storm. It wasn't moving like weather. It was assembling. The first human observations. The first human report came from a commercial airline pilot flying over the North Atlantic. At 11:47 local time, he radioed air traffic control. There's something strange with the horizon. It looks like it's glowing, but the sun isn't low enough for that kind of refraction. Controllers assumed atmospheric reflection. But 12 minutes later, a second pilot reported something more disturbing. The sky ahead of us is turning red, not orange, not sunset red. It's like blood in the atmosphere. At that point, controllers began checking satellite feeds. What they saw caused immediate confusion. A large-scale optical distortion was spreading across upper atmospheric layers. No known meteorological phenomenon matched its structure. But still, no emergency was declared, because nothing in their training explained what they were seeing. When the sky first turned red, in coastal cities, the change was sudden. The horizon darkened first, then ignited. A deep red glow rose from the edge of the world, like a curtain being pulled upward. People stopped walking. Traffic slowed, then stopped entirely. At first, there was awe. Social media exploded instantly. Videos flooded timelines. Look at the sky! This is insane! It looks like Mars is above us. But within minutes, admiration turned into uncertainty. Because the red didn't fade. It spread across the sky like liquid light, and it moved too fast to be normal sunset physics. The moment humanity realized something was wrong, psychologists later described what happened next as collective cognitive dissonance. People tried to rationalize it. Volcanic dust, solar refraction, wildfire smoke at high altitude. But none of these explanations fit what they were seeing. Because the sky was not just red. It was structured. Bands of color formed across the atmosphere in repeating patterns, almost symmetrical, almost intentional. And then came the silence. Birds stopped calling. Wind slowed. Even city noise seemed muted. It was as if the world itself was reacting to what was happening above it. The atmosphere begins to respond. By late afternoon, scientists noticed something alarming. The red sky was not static. It was responding to environmental changes. When wind speeds shifted, the color bands shifted. When humidity rose, the intensity deepened. When electromagnetic readings fluctuated, the sky flickered. This was the first moment someone said it aloud in a research briefing. It behaves like it's reacting. The room went silent because that implication was impossible. Atmosphere does not react. Atmosphere does not respond. Atmosphere does not behave. And yet, the data suggested exactly that. Airspace collapse begins. As the phenomenon expanded, aviation systems began to fail. Radar interference increased. GPS signals destabilized. Pilots flying through the red zones reported complete visual disorientation. One cockpit recording captured a pilot saying, "There is no horizon anymore. Everything outside is just red." Another reported, "We cannot distinguish sky from ground. It's all the same color." Air traffic control began issuing emergency diversions. But aircraft already in the red zone experienced something worse than visibility loss. They reported pressure irregularities at cruising altitude. Cabin lights flickered in synchronized pulses with atmospheric changes outside. One flight vanished from radar entirely over the Pacific. No explosion, no debris, just silence. The world starts to panic. As evening approached, cities entered full uncertainty. Emergency alerts were issued. Governments attempted to explain the situation. But language failed. How do you warn billions about something that has no known classification? People were told, stay indoors, avoid unnecessary travel. Do not panic. But panic had already begun because the sky was no longer a background. It had become the main event. And it was still changing. The red expands beyond borders. By the time night began to fall in the eastern hemisphere, the phenomenon was no longer regional. It was global. What started as a strange horizon glow had now become a continuous atmospheric layer stretching across continents. Satellite imagery confirmed it. A massive red band had formed in the upper atmosphere, expanding in waves like a slow-moving pulse circling the planet. It did not behave like weather. It did not drift with wind patterns. It moved with consistency, as if following an internal logic.
Meteorological centers across the world began exchanging urgent data packets. Every system said the same thing. This is not a known atmospheric event. And yet, it was happening anyway.
Global confusion and denial. In the first hours of global spread, governments attempted to contain panic. Official statements were carefully worded. Unusual atmospheric refraction event. Temporary optical phenomenon. No immediate danger to public safety. But the public had already seen the sky. And denial collapses quickly when reality is visible above every rooftop. In major cities, Dhaka, London, Tokyo, Cairo, Sao Paulo, people gathered in open spaces, staring upward in silence. Phones recorded everything. The sky glowing red, like molten glass. Cloud layers forming unnatural symmetrical bands. Light bending in ways that defied sunset physics. And beneath it all, an uneasy feeling no one could explain. A sensation of being observed. Not scientifically, emotionally. The aviation system begins to fail. The first true systemic collapse began in aviation. At 1842 UTC, multiple international flights simultaneously reported navigation errors. Not small errors, total system destabilization. GPS signals flickered between locations. Radar returns became inconsistent. Compass readings shifted without magnetic justification. Pilots described something even more disturbing. The sky outside is uniform red. There is no reference point, no horizon, no depth. Flights attempting to exit affected zones reported sudden turbulence spikes despite stable weather data. Inside cockpits, instruments began behaving unpredictably. Altitude readings fluctuated. Autopilot disengaged randomly. Communication systems distorted voices. Then came the first confirmed disappearance. A passenger aircraft crossing the Pacific simply vanished from tracking systems. No distress call, no debris field, no radar signature. Just absence. A void in the data. And that absence caused something more powerful than fear. Uncertainty. Cities under the red sky. As the red layer intensified, urban environments began to change perception. It was no longer just above. It was everywhere, reflected in glass buildings, absorbed by water surfaces, diffused through smog and atmosphere until the entire world felt tinted. Streetlights flickered as if reacting to unseen pressure changes. Traffic slowed across multiple megacities simultaneously, not due to orders, but instinct. People began to gather in large numbers. Not protesting, not celebrating, just watching. A shared silence spread across crowds in different continents at the same time. Psychologists later described this as mass environmental shock response. But in the moment, it felt simpler. The world was waiting for something to happen. The first mass psychological effects? Within hours of global exposure, hospitals began reporting unusual symptoms. Not physical injury, psychological destabilization. Common reports included intense pressure sensation in the chest, heightened auditory sensitivity, visual distortions when looking at the sky, sense of time dilation. Some patients described feeling out of sync with reality. Others reported a far more disturbing experience. It feels like the sky is aware of me looking at it. Emergency psychiatric teams were deployed in several major cities. But the symptoms were not localized. They were global and synchronized. The sky begins to structure itself. By late evening, scientists noticed a critical change. The red atmospheric layer was no longer random. It had developed structure. High-altitude imaging revealed repeating geometric formations within the red haze. Parallel bands, circular interference rings, wave-like pulses moving across continents. It was as if the atmosphere had organized itself into a system. One atmospheric physicist made a statement during an emergency briefing. "We are no longer observing a passive phenomenon. We are observing a dynamic system responding to planetary conditions." The implication was immediate. If it responds, it may also evolve. Flight zone collapse and sky blindness. As the red layer thickened, aviation authorities expanded no-fly zones globally. But enforcement was irrelevant. Aircraft already airborne were trapped in regions of visual failure. Pilots described a terrifying uniformity. There is no sky texture anymore, just red everywhere. Depth perception became impossible. Cloud formations disappeared into uniform color fields. Even stars were no longer visible at night. Navigation based on visual reference collapsed entirely. One cockpit recording captured a pilot whispering, "We are flying inside something, not through it." Moments later, the transmission cut out. The atmosphere begins to exert pressure. At ground level, atmospheric pressure readings began to fluctuate subtly, not dangerously at first, but consistently. Sensors across continents recorded synchronized micro-variations in pressure that defied weather modeling. Doors in buildings began to behave oddly. The atmosphere begins to exert pressure. At ground level, atmospheric pressure readings began to fluctuate subtly. Not dangerously at first, but consistently. Sensors across continents recorded synchronized micro-variations in pressure that defied weather modeling. Doors in buildings began to behave oddly, opening slightly without wind, closing without force, vibrating in rhythmic intervals. Windows rattled in patterns that matched satellite-detected atmospheric pulses. Something in the sky was exerting influence. Downward. Not physically. Structurally. As if the entire atmosphere had become a connected system. Approximately 21:30 UTC, something unprecedented occurred. Across multiple continents, simultaneously. Birdsong stopped. Wind dropped to near stillness. Urban noise levels decreased noticeably. Even industrial zones recorded unusual acoustic reduction. It was not a blackout. It was a silence field, a global pause in environmental sound. People described it as the world holding its breath. During this silence, the red sky reached its most intense phase yet, a deep, saturated crimson covering the entire visible atmosphere. And then, it flickered. Once. When science begins to break. By the third phase of the event, science had entered a dangerous state. Not ignorance, not uncertainty, but contradiction. Every data set collected across the world agreed on one thing. The red sky was real, but none of the models agreed on what it was doing. Atmospheric physicists, meteorologists, and satellite engineers gathered in emergency coordination rooms across multiple countries. The problem was simple to describe, but impossible to solve. A global atmospheric system was behaving like a unified structure. Not random, not chaotic, but coordinated. And coordination implies something terrifying: organization. The first unified atmosphere model. At a joint international research facility, a breakthrough hypothesis emerged. A scientist presented a revised model. What if the atmosphere is not just reacting, but operating as a coupled system? At first, the idea was dismissed, but the data forced reconsideration. Satellite feeds showed synchronized pulse waves in upper atmosphere, repeating geometric interference bands, consistent response to magnetic field fluctuations, mirrored patterns across hemispheres. It was not weather. It was not radiation. It was not reflection. It behaved like a single connected field, a planetary scale system responding as one. The team gave it an unofficial name: Atmospheric Coupled Response System, ACAS-RS. But even they admitted it sounded too structured to be natural. The sky starts answering Earth. At this stage, something even more disturbing was observed. The red sky was no longer just reacting to environmental changes, it was anticipating them. When seismic activity began in one region, atmospheric red intensity increased seconds before the tremor. When solar radiation spikes occurred, atmospheric pulses adjusted in advance. When large-scale electrical grid fluctuations happened, sky patterns shifted first. One researcher said during a live briefing, "It is behaving like it knows what Earth is about to do before we do." The room went silent, because that statement removed the last assumption of randomness and introduced something far more uncomfortable: prediction. Satellites confirm structure. Orbiting satellites provided the clearest evidence yet. High-resolution imaging showed the red layer was not uniform. It had structure. Not cloud structure, not atmospheric layering, but geometric repetition. Spiral formations spanning continents, concentric wave rings centered over oceanic zones, grid-like interference patterns forming and dissolving. The patterns were not stable. They evolved. And they evolved in synchronization across hemispheres. One engineer made a critical observation. It looks like a system trying to stabilize itself. But stabilize what? The atmosphere? The planet? Or something else entirely? No one answered. Global government fracture. As data became harder to interpret, governments began to fracture in response. Some agencies pushed for transparency. Others enforced information control. In several regions, communication between scientific bodies and government leadership broke down entirely. Three competing narratives emerged: natural atmospheric anomaly theory, unknown external particle interaction theory, unclassified planetary electromagnetic system theory. None could be confirmed. But one thing was clear: public trust was collapsing. Because people were no longer listening to explanations. They were looking at the sky. And the sky was still red, still structured, still changing. The theory that was never released: in classified research circles, a more controversial hypothesis began circulating. It was never officially published, but fragments leaked through internal reports. It suggested The red atmospheric layer was not caused by a single event,
but a feedback loop, a system in which Earth's magnetic fluctuations, solar radiation inputs, atmospheric particle alignment, electromagnetic interference were all feeding into a self-organizing global layer.
and that layer was feeding back into Earth. A closed system, a loop, a planetary-scale interaction cycle. One scientist wrote in a private note, "We are not observing the sky anymore. We are observing a conversation between Earth and its atmosphere." When reality starts to feel unstable, as this theory spread internally, something psychological began happening. Globally, people started reporting a strange sensation that the sky felt closer. Not physically, but perceptually. As if the boundary between Earth and atmosphere was thinning. Common reports included dizziness when looking upward, time distortion during sky observation, emotional discomfort under red intensification. Even animals reacted differently. Birds changed migration direction unexpectedly. Livestock refused open field exposure. Nocturnal animals became active during daytime red peaks. It was as if the entire biosphere was adjusting to atmospheric behavior. Final aviation breakdown. By this stage, global aviation was functionally non-operational in affected regions. Not due to bans, but due to inability to navigate. Pilots reported complete loss of environmental reference. One final recorded transmission captured a haunting statement. The sky stabilizes too perfectly. Then, unexpectedly, a shift occurred. The red layer stopped expanding. Satellite data showed something strange. It stabilized. Uniform intensity across hemispheres. Perfect symmetry in pattern distribution. Almost balanced. Scientists described it as the system has reached equilibrium. But equilibrium in what? Because nothing natural reaches perfect symmetry without constraint. And constraints imply structure. And structure implies design, even if no one could prove it. The stable sky that was not stable. The world entered an uneasy silence. The red sky had stabilized. No further expansion, no new patterns, no escalation. At first, scientists called it relief. But relief never lasted long in events no one understands. Because stability in a system that was never stable is not comfort. It is containment. And containment implies limits have been reached. But no one knew what those limits were, or who set them. The global watch state. Across the planet, people developed a new behavior. They began watching the sky constantly. Not out of curiosity, but expectation. Schools paused outdoor activities. Workers stepped outside during breaks just to check the horizon. Families gathered at night without speaking, only observing. It was as if humanity had entered a shared psychological condition, anticipatory vigilance. Because once you have seen the sky change once, you begin to believe it can change again at any moment. And no one wanted to be caught looking away when it did. The second wave that never came. At first, days passed. Then, weeks. The red sky remained stable. Satellite systems confirmed no expansion. Atmospheric readings showed no escalation. For the first time since the event began, The world started to breathe again. But beneath that calm was something unresolved. Because none of the core questions had been answered. What caused it? Why did it behave like a system? Why did it synchronize globally? Why did it stop? And most importantly, was it truly over?
The flicker event. On the 19th day of stability, it happened. At first, it was subtle. A minor fluctuation in red intensity over oceanic regions. Barely noticeable. Then, simultaneously across satellite networks, the entire atmospheric layer flickered. Just once.
A synchronized global pulse. Every monitoring station recorded it at the same timestamp. No delay, no gradient. Instant. A perfect atmospheric synchronization event. Scientists immediately reviewed data logs.
Nothing indicated a trigger. No solar storm, no seismic activity, no electromagnetic disruption. It happened without cause. And that made it worse. Because it suggested one possibility. The system was still active. Just waiting. The unanswered signal theory. In classified analysis, a disturbing hypothesis emerged. Some researchers proposed the flicker was not random. It was structured. A heartbeat-like event. If true, that meant the red sky was not static. It was periodic, alive in rhythm. One researcher stated in a confidential briefing, "This is not atmospheric decay. This is atmospheric maintenance." But maintenance of what? A balance? A system? Or communication? No one agreed. But no one could ignore the pattern anymore. Because patterns repeated. And repetition implies intention.
Humanity adapts to the unexplained. As months passed, society slowly adapted. The red sky became normalized. Not understood, just accepted. Children grew up under it.
Artists painted it. Photographers captured it as background. News cycles moved on to other crises. But psychologically, something had changed permanently. People reported long-term effects.
Heightened awareness of environmental changes, increased sensitivity to atmospheric shifts, persistent subconscious sky-watching behavior. The sky had become part of human psychological baseline awareness. Not fear, not wonder, something in between, something unresolved. The scientific dead end. Eventually, research stagnated. Not because interest disappeared, but because data stopped yielding answers. Every model failed to replicate the phenomenon. Every simulation collapsed under inconsistency. Even advanced atmospheric coupling systems could not reproduce the red sky behavior. One final scientific consensus draft was written. The phenomenon exceeds current atmospheric modeling capability and may require redefinition of planetary atmospheric interaction theory. In simpler terms, human science had reached its limit, and something about the sky had not. The final fade, din. Without announcement, it began. The red sky slowly weakened, not abruptly, not dramatically, gradually. Color saturation decreased across hemispheres. Satellite feeds confirmed uniform decline in intensity. Over several days, the atmosphere returned to its natural blue spectrum,
No explosion. No event. No trigger. Just fading. Like a system powering down. And that quiet ending created more confusion than the phenomenon itself. Because nothing that behaves like that should simply stop. The aftermath question. In the years that followed, historians, scientists, and psychologists debated endlessly. 3 dominant interpretations emerged. 1. Natural rare atmospheric resonance event. 2. Unknown planetary electromagnetic feedback system. 3. Unidentified self-regulating atmospheric phenomenon. But none fully explained the synchronization, the structure, the predictive behavior, the flicker event, or the final fade. The truth remained incomplete. And in incomplete truths, humans tend to imagine more. The philosophical shift. Beyond science, the event changed how people viewed Earth itself. Before the red sky, the atmosphere was background. After it, the atmosphere became presence. People began to understand something deeply unsettling. We do not live under a passive sky. We live under a system we barely understand. One philosopher described it simply. We thought the sky was empty. We discovered it might not be silent. Years later, there are no monuments marking the event. No official Remembrance Day. No global memorial. Only scattered footage and fragmented memories. But those who witnessed it firsthand describe a shared feeling that never fully leaves them. Years later, there are no monuments marking the event. No official Remembrance Day. No global memorial. Only scattered footage and fragmented memories. But those who witnessed it firsthand describe a shared feeling that never fully leaves them. The end of the documentary. The sky returned to blue. But something subtle had changed forever. Not in the atmosphere. In us. Because now we know. The sky can change. And we may not always understand why.